Hello, Partnering for Vaccine Equity, learning community members, and others working on vaccine equity. Welcome to this afternoon's learning events. I'm Jenny Haley. I'm part of the group learning team at the Urban Institute. And on behalf of our whole team, thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited today, not only because we have a great presentation in store, but because this session kicks off a series on understanding and addressing vaccine confidence. So we will have a series of 4 sessions on increasing vaccine confidence and the role of motivational interviewing techniques. So that includes this webinar that you're in right now, and then a second one featuring the same speaker who I'll introduce in just a moment. And then we will follow that with 2 training workshops, which will feature paid partner Lantern Community Services, one in English and one in Spanish. Very exciting. So before we go further, I'll do our typical quick review of how this session will work. You've all been muted upon entry to the session. Please stay on mute unless you're speaking to keep the discussion going. The chat room feature is open today. We encourage you to introduce yourself. If you have a question for the speaker, you can type it into the Q&A at any time. And we will reserve time at the end of the session for your questions. We offer live interpretation from English to Spanish during our events. If you would like to listen to the Spanish language channel, simply click on the globe icon in the Zoom taskbar. It should be down right at the bottom of your screen. Finally, as with all of our learning events, we will post the slides and recording of the event on our community website and circulate them through the digests that go out as part of the CDC managed adult vax program listserv, which all program members should be a part of. If you have any technical difficulties at any point during the session, you may send an email to our community manager's inbox. That's vaxequitylearning@urban.org. We'll be watching the inbox and we'll try to help you as quickly as we can. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our featured speaker. Dr. Kenneth Resnikow is the Erwin Rosenstock Professor of Health Behavior and Health Education at the University of Michigan School of Public Health and Professor of Pediatrics in the School of Medicine. Also the Associate Director for Community Engagement and Health Disparities Research at the University of Michigan Rogel Cancer Center and Chief Scientific Lead at the university's Center for Health Communications Research. His work includes designing and evaluating behavior change programs for a wide range of health behaviors, including vaccine take-up, and increasingly entails novel behavioral tailoring and the incorporation of e-health technology to enhance the impact of health messages. He also has a focus on racial, ethnic, and underserved populations, particularly African Americans, Native Alaskans, Hispanics, and Middle Eastern North Africans. Thanks so much to you, Ken, for joining us today, and you may begin whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Jenny, for the kind introduction and for inviting me today. I'd also like to welcome Liz Bacon, who helped conduct the study and do many of the analyses that we'll share with you today. She's on the call with us. Today's part one of 2 parts. Today, I'm going to talk to you about sort of the why. Why are people hesitant to get the COVID vaccine? I'm going to share with you initially some national data relying on some public data sources, including the Kaiser Family Foundation periodic survey, their COVID dashboard. But then I'm going to share with you some new unpublished data about some of the deeper psychologic characteristics that seem to be driving hesitance and uptake. When I meet with you again in December, we're going to talk more about the clinical use of motivational interviewing to overcome some of the resistance sources that we'll be talking about today. So let's begin by getting a sense. I think I'm going to move this bar here so it's not obscuring. Let's get a sense of where we are in terms of who is unvaccinated currently. This is a somewhat complicated chart, but let's take a look at the green part. So the green part is the unvaccinated folks in the US. And their data from Kaiser mirrors data from several other sources as well. And what you can see is there's some groups who have very low rates of being unvaccinated. Folks above 65, Democrats and college graduates. And on the bottom, you see some of the groups that have the highest rates of being unvaccinated, people under 65, Republicans, and people with lower income. So I've taken this data and combined them into a chart to show you of what are the biggest drivers, meaning where are the biggest differences? And the biggest differences demographically. We're going to talk more psychologically in the second half of the talk, but demographically, the biggest distinguishing factor is political party. Republicans are 34% unvaccinated, Democrats 9%. That's a 25% difference just based on your political affiliation. The next largest distinguishing factor is age. 28% of people 18 to 29 versus 12, a 16 point difference. And then you could see the other three drivers that I've pulled out of that chart: education, income, and rural urban residents are the other three big demographic drivers of who is unvaccinated. Now I want to look at a slightly different variable, not who is unvaccinated, but who has stated, I'm never going to get this. We will refer to them today as the hard no group, HARDNO. And what you can see, maybe somewhat contrary to how many of us thought, race, in this case, the comparison of Black, Hispanic, and white, so sort of race and ethnicity, they're really all about the same. In terms of the percent of unvaccinated who say, I am never getting this, it's really about the same by race. However, there are several demographic characteristics for which there was a very large difference in the hard no or vaccine hesitant group. And the first distinguishing factor is college education. So amongst individuals with less than a college education, fully 25% of Americans are in the hard no category, compared to only 12% in those who have a college or greater education. Another large discriminating factor, like it was for being unvaccinated, is rural versus urban residents. So you see in rural populations, 31% are in the hard no, definitely won't get it category, versus 16% in the urban. And finally, not surprising, Republican versus Democrat is a very large distinguishing factor. 33% of American Republicans are in the hard no, never get it, versus 6%. And again, I've taken that data just to show you, once again, the biggest discriminating factor of who is in hard no category. It's political party with a 27-point difference, simply subtracting 33 from 6, urbanicity 15, and education 13. Now, some of you are going to be interested in the more recent bivalent or Omicron booster, which has been available for a little bit over a month plus, and which is still just starting to get into the bloodstream of Americans. So as you can see here, still the largest group that is out there demographically in terms of getting this as of about a survey 6 weeks ago is 8%. It's increased in the last few weeks and will continue to increase. But once again, you see some of the same predictors, both age and political party are also driving who's getting the new bivalent Omicron booster. Now, something very interesting happened over the last year and a half, 2 years. When the vaccines first became available, a very large percent of Americans, and particularly African Americans, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, fell into the wait and see category. This segment, however, has trickled down to close to nothing. It is now just 3 or 4%. So that is a group that has really disappeared from the landscape. They said they'd wait and see. They wait, they saw, they got vaccinated, at least in terms of the primary vaccine, not the Omicron. That there is still some wait and see, but this is for the original 2-shot regimen. But what is fascinating is the definitely not group has not only not decreased, it's actually slightly increased over the last year and a half. So there's something very unique about this hard no group. And I'm going to spend the remainder of my time really trying to help you understand the hard no group. One reason it matters is, assuming herd immunity is still a viable construct, and assuming we do want people to be in a protected state, we can't afford as a country to have 17-20% of the population not taking the vaccine. Now, even within the wait and see group, while they were active, there were interesting racial and ethnic differences. So for African Americans, they were much more likely than white Americans to worry about the long-term effects of the COVID vaccine. And they were also worried about the serious side effects. Now, one of the reasons these were active about a year ago, these have dissipated in part because evidence has come out that these are not as great as concerns as we originally or previously thought. Just to throw in, although I'm going to focus on adults, I thought you might be interested that there are some racial and ethnic differences in concerns over vaccines for those 6 months to 4 years, a more recently approved segment. And you could see very little difference in these concerns. I'll let you read these to yourself. 1, 2, 3, 4. But pretty big ethnic and racial differences regarding these concerns. Taking off from work, no trusted source, the potential for an out-of-pocket expense. For these, there are substantial racial and ethnic differences, suggesting opportunities for group targeting or group tailoring. So now I'd like to get into the more psychological aspect of this hard no. What is driving it? So I'm going to start with some publicly available data and then get into the data that Liz and I are putting a manuscript together as we speak. So first of all, you probably could get this, but the Kaiser survey periodically has asked about how much do you trust CDC regarding COVID-19? Whereas for Democrats, there has been almost no drop in faith in the CDC. Amongst Republicans, there's a very large decline from around the time the vaccine started to become approved and available to this past spring, a very large drop in faith in the CDC. Not surprising, they also ask about faith in Dr. Fauci, whereas it has virtually remained stable for the Democrat population of the US, it has dropped significantly in the Republican population in the US. Now let's see if we can figure out what might be going on behind that. So first of all, here's sort of the traditional barriers to being unvaccinated. And you could see, just scan them yourselves, side effects, not safe, affect my fertility. This was sort of the first wave of COVID-specific barriers, okay? And there are some subtle racial and ethnic differences. For example, Hispanic Americans who may not have insurance are more concerned about out-of-pocket. So now I'd like to share with you some of our data. Some of it's been published, but this was our first paper where we had gotten in very early on in the pandemic and the vaccines weren't available. So here, what we were predicting was COVID protective behaviors, particularly staying home and wearing a mask. So we created an index of COVID protective behaviors. The higher your score on this index, the more protective behaviors you were performing. And then we wanted to ask about 3 different what we called novel predictors. Now, these are also going to be in the new data I'm going to share, the unpublished data, so it's going to repeat itself. We asked about a personality trait called reactance. Take a look at the items. Reactance is a psychological state where you generally go in the opposite direction of someone telling you what to do. So typically, if someone is high in reactance and authority tells them what to do, they will do the opposite. So we were interested in whether or not, notice these are not about COVID. This is a general personality attribute. So we were interested in whether or not trait reactance, the personality trait, was associated with protective behaviors. Then we also asked about 2 COVID-specific beliefs, about conspiracy, that this whole thing is sort of a scam and we're being manipulated, and also whether or not you thought this was the end of the world and the rapture is coming. And it turns out that those 3 attributes, the psychological trait of reactance, COVID conspiracy beliefs, and beliefs in the apocalypse and the rapture, were all significantly negatively associated with protective behaviors. And in simple terms, all that means is as your trait reactance went up, your protective behaviors went down. As your belief in conspiracy beliefs went up, your COVID protective behaviors went down. And same if you believe in the rapture, your COVID protective behaviors went down. And all these, for those of you who have a little statistical background, these are all statistically significant. So last year, we were interested in whether or not some of these same predictors were also suppressing vaccine uptake and whether or not they were in fact associated with vaccine hesitance or the hard no group. So we did another national survey and we collected 1,400 usable adult surveys. And this is what our sample looks like. So decent distribution about race, okay for ethnicity, not perfect, should be about 18%, and decent education and income diversity. We divided the sample into 3 categories of vaccination status. So first of all, vaccinated, okay, and this was any dose at the time. Unvaccinated, but may get it, and that included the wait and see group, or only if required, or not sure, but any of the unvaccinated who were not hard no. And then the group of interest, this 17%, which is about exactly what it is in the Kaiser data, we really wanted to understand what's driving the hard no group. So we measured something that you already recognize. We measured reactance again. And you probably can guess what the results are, but I'll share them with you. So we used a 5-item reactance scale that we used in the first paper, but we added some new variables. We added an item about QAnon beliefs, and we took this from some national studies that have found that this is a very strong thread in the QAnon belief system. This single item is a pretty good predictor that you have QAnon predisposition. And then we measured a personality trait called dogmatism. If you would be so kind, take a minute to read the items and see if you could guess what we were trying to get at. Take a look at the items yourself for a second. So this is a personality attribute. It's not directly related to COVID-19 or to vaccines, just like reactance was a personality attribute. And what this is really getting at is how open are you to the possibility that your beliefs are wrong? How rigid are you intellectually? How open are you to new information? And if you're high in dogmatism, you're low on all of those attributes. We also are interested in how your gender role models might be related, because there has been some discussion in the lay literature and in the media that individuals who are resistant to the vaccine may have hypermasculinity. So we were interested in that as well. So let's take a look at the results, and I'll walk you through them for those of you who didn't do well in stats in college. So first of all, you can see the 5 items that were the measures of reactance. They were measured from disagree to strongly agree. So the higher your score, the more reactant you are. Well, was that associated with hard no? Well, it is. So the mean score, which is simply taking the average of these 5 items between a 1 to 5 scale, you see that people in the hard no group were significantly higher by almost a point, half a point, than people in the vaccinated and the maybe group. So this is a observation from our data that people who are in the hard no category are more reactant. They are less receptive to having authority tell them what to do. Now let's look at dogmatism. Remember how we measured that. This is whether or not you're open to the potential of feeling that your beliefs might be wrong, or you're open to new information. The higher you score on this, the more rigid your thinking is and the less open you are to having new information change your attitudes or behaviors. Was it associated with vaccine status? It was, and quite strongly. So what we see is the average score on the dogmatism scale was significantly higher by 0.7 points, which in our world is a pretty big difference amongst the hard no group versus the vaccinated group. So far we have 2 personality traits, reactance and dogmatism, that seem to be behind some of the vaccine hesitance, particularly the hard no group. Now let's look at some political beliefs. Now, I didn't show you these items up front, but I saved them. So we were interested in their endorsement of some beliefs about the election being stolen or fraudulent. And they were answered on a scale of 0 to 4. So higher scores are more endorsement of it because you said it was true, which gives you a value of 2. Well, what you can see is individuals in the hard no group were much more likely, almost by a factor of 2, much more likely to endorse these beliefs. And of course, as you could guess, they're highly correlated with political party. So now one that we mentioned earlier, a single item that captures to a large extent affiliation with the QAnon belief system. Now we're going to talk about percents instead of means. And this is the percent that said this is true. So amongst the hard no group, that 17, 18% of Americans who are unvaccinated and who say, I ain't getting it, 30% endorsed the truth of this statement. Now you may say, why is this so high, 12 and 17? That is because in online surveys, there is a small subset of people who answer them without paying attention. And so you get some random noise. So there's some random noise in this. So the real value is probably something like 20%, but nonetheless, it is 2.5 times higher than the vaccinated group's endorsement of this same item. There are some other religious beliefs that also seem to be strongly associated with the hard no group. We asked them about, is the vaccine the mark of the beast? Now, this is something in Christian theology, particularly towards the end of times, that it is a mark that you're not on the good side of things. You're not going to be taken to the kingdom of heaven. It's a sign that you're unworthy or perhaps on the dark side. And what you could see is 15% of the hard no group endorse that the vaccine, getting it, puts you on the dark side. Now, this is complicated because amongst many religious folks, they will believe in both the vaccine and God will protect them. So they're not exclusive, but nonetheless, almost 2.5 times more likely in the unvaccinated hard no group to rely primarily on God rather than the vaccine. Now, this is not meant to be comical or to be mocking. There are many people who very seriously think of the world in terms of the end of times and the rapture. And what we found is when those items were put together into a scale with a score of 1 to 5, there is a statistically significant increase in endorsement of these items amongst the hard no group. Now, you can see why this could be very important. If you believe the end of times is coming and that people who have accepted Christ and who have been living on in the light are going to be saved, it makes the end of times less negative, less fearful, and it may discourage you from getting the vaccine. So I think it's a very important variable to understand that can be behind some of the vaccine hesitance we're seeing. We also asked people about their progressiveness, and I guess you could probably at this point guess that people who view themselves as very traditional, 27% in the hard no group versus 11% in the vaccinated. And in terms of progressive, it's the opposite. 16% of the vaccinated group said they're very progressive versus 5%. So you can see that worldview, it's more than politics. It's sort of a combination of politics and religion, but the worldview amongst the unvaccinated is very different. A couple other things before we close out and open it up for discussion. We also measured what's called conspiracy beliefs about the virus. I'll just let you take a look at them. We hypothesized, like other folks, that people who endorse these beliefs, which you could argue are simply scientifically false, most of them, you are going to be less likely to get the vaccine and more likely to be in the hard no category, and that's what we found. So when we added up the mean score in these beliefs, what you see is a much higher score, 3.6 in the hard no group, endorsing these beliefs. Now, you may be interested in particular items, so I'm going to show you one or two. The cases and deaths are being greatly exaggerated. So you see 43%. This is a very big discriminating factor. If you remember the differences I showed earlier by income, education, and political party, they weren't nearly as large as this. This is a 30% difference just on this one item. So it really seems that the unvaccinated hard no group really feels this is a bit of a scam, that the government and the media are making stuff up. A very large percent, 16%, feel Bill Gates has put microchips into the COVID vaccine. The virus is being spread deliberately by a group of powerful people to gain advantage, 38 versus 14, rounding it. Again, a very large difference amongst the hard no versus the vaccinated. Then a couple of things about COVID vaccine myths that we asked as a separate scale. Take a look. These are not necessarily conspiratorial beliefs, but are simply false fears about the vaccine. And I guess you're going to be able to predict what we found. That adding up the number of times you endorse it, which is how many times did you say it was true, there was a very large difference. That the hard no group had a score of 4, which means they were endorsing 4 out of 5 of these items. So what I'd like to do is take a breath and try to help us synthesize these findings, understand these findings, and then show you some ideas of communication strategies that might help, particularly for the hard no group. So first of all, I want to remind us that there's really, in effect, 3 audience segments, or what we call psychosegments, around vaccine hesitance. This is one group, and they're the group that says, I haven't been vaccinated, but it's not because I'm against it. I'm open to it. In fact, I'll do it as soon as I have the time, the place, and I don't have to miss work. Then there's the wait and see group. There's still a small percent of Americans in that group. It was a very large percent December 20. It's gradually shrunk, but we still have to come up with strategies to impact this group. And African Americans are still overrepresented in the wait and see group. For African Americans, it's often don't experiment on us, let someone else go first. Now let's summarize the third segment that we really spent the bulk of our time today talking about. And let's review what we found. What is behind the hard no, which we now are going to add to it, the ideologic objection to vaccines. So first of all, demographically, they are more likely to be white, male, rural, pro-Trump Republicans with lower education who are younger. Psychologically, we identified from our research, and I'm also blending in some other research because we didn't measure trait paranoia, but other people have. These are some of the personality characteristics that our research, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, as well as research of others, have identified are more common amongst the hard no group. So take a look. Now, I don't want to, and I'm trying not to be glib, this is very serious stuff. It's also very daunting because as you're probably sitting there listening to this, you're asking, what the heck can we do? How do you persuade someone who has these personality attributes? So hang on, we're going to get there a little bit. So now I want to get into, from a psychological perspective, what we think is really going on and what's challenging. Vaccine hesitance, particularly for COVID-19, but also broader vaccine hesitance, is values concordant. And that may sound like a bunch of gibberish, but let me explain. The individuals who are saying, hell no, I'm never going to do this, feel that that decision aligns with their spiritual beliefs, their personal autonomy, and their deeper values as an American. They believe they're protecting God, core, and country. Now, that is very unique, and let me explain. People who smoke cigarettes or who take opiates, they don't say, this completely aligns with my view of God, core, and country. This is something that really makes me feel good about myself. For most health behaviors, I'm in a school of public health. So diet, physical activities, substance use, taking your medication, the risky end of that behavior is almost never aligned with your core values. And for that reason, persuasion is relatively easy. But what makes COVID-19 vaccine hesitance, particularly in the hard no category, so challenging is that the individuals in that group feel they're doing something noble. They're protecting their family, they're protecting Americans' freedoms. We also know that because of dogmatism and reactance, they're highly resistant, if not immune, to new information or information that may contradict their beliefs. There's also evidence from other people's work that the hard no group has a bias against science and education, like college education is net harmful to society. And there's negative views about both healthcare and the pharmaceutical industry. Perhaps most importantly, the hard no group views largely that COVID policies, including vaccine mandates, are oppressive. They are contrary to the American values of freedom. Individuals should choose. Similar to perhaps how some people view motorcycle helmets. Also, there's a little bit of a political interaction that for some people in the hard no group, it's a statement, it's a middle finger to the left that you're not going to impose your values on this. It's for people who are weak, we're strong, we're independent, we don't need your help. So there's a little bit of, it's a form of reactance, sort of social reactance, that we're going to do this in part to show you that you're wrong. Now, let's get to what can we do about it. So for the pragmatic concerns group, the solutions are relatively straightforward. We want to make sure that we could get them free and convenient injections, confirm that it's safe, and make sure they don't have to worry about missing work. For the wait and see group, we want to make sure we acknowledge and we don't diminish the importance of historical structural racism that persists today. We want to incorporate that in our messaging. We want to make sure that the vaccines come from trusted sources and that the information is communicated in a clear and coherent way. Now you're asking, what do we do for this group? Well, it's not futile. We have a lot of things we know from behavioral science. So first of all, we're going to talk today very briefly, but we're going to confirm it in our talk in December about how to do it, what's called rolling with resistance or affirmation. The types of things that include affirmation and rolling resistance are statements like, you really care about your family. You're trying to make the right decision. You're standing up for what you think is right. So we don't want to argue over every little point of their argument. We want to accept it. We want to affirm that fundamentally they're trying to do the right thing. We also want to roll with resistance. We want to state back to them, you're concerned about safety. You're worried that the government is imposing on you. You don't trust that the vaccines are safe. Don't worry, for those of you who haven't tried this type of communication, that by reflecting it back, it means you endorse it. Now, you wouldn't say, I completely agree with you, the government is making this up. You take out the I completely agree with you, and you simply say, you feel the government is making this up. So one of the skills I'll show you with a little video clip, and that we'll talk about in a couple of weeks, is this idea of affirm their effort to try and figure this out, affirm their commitment to protecting their family, affirm the fact that they care about America, and also don't argue with them as your first pass. Don't try and educate, don't try and contradict. We know for people who are high on reactance and on dogmatism, simply correcting false beliefs will actually make things worse. You'll actually entrench them. So we'll show you some alternative ways to how to handle that. We do think there are some techniques that have been used successfully in other domains about just raising doubt. So for example, some people have tried this, that you may talk to someone who might be in the hard no group and to say, there's an interesting thing that I found, that almost all of the anchors at Fox News, although they don't come out and say it, when it's been investigated, it turns out they're all vaccinated. And you just leave it out there. You don't say necessarily you're being played, you're being lied to. You just leave it out there and say, that's just curious, and don't interpret it for them. It's called you provide, they decide. You provide the raw material, but don't interpret it for them. And don't say you've been duped, you've been lied to. That will probably create reactance. But if you can point out some interesting facts, and people are already perhaps susceptible to feeling conspiratory beliefs, maybe that same conspiratory belief could be turned against some of their news sources. We also think it's important to use the right sources, and I'll show you some examples of using pastors to communicate for African Americans in Michigan. So I'm going to first show you a clip that we'll talk about in our MI session in a couple of weeks, but here's what the skill of reflection combined with something called Ask, Tell, Ask would look like in a COVID-19 conversation. It would be great. And as soon as they hit play, someone in the chat say, yes, Ken, we can hear and see it.
I read that I won't be able to have kids if I get the vaccine. It's not for me.
Okay. You're worried it might affect your ability to have healthy children. The COVID vaccines are new. It's normal for you to have questions. Our doctors here have thought about this as well. Is it okay for me to share their thoughts with you?
Sure.
Based on everything that we know, there is no reason to believe that the vaccine will affect a person's ability to have children. Scientists tested all the COVID vaccines in clinical trials with thousands of participants. There is no evidence that the vaccine causes fertility problems. The safety of the vaccines is being monitored to make sure that they are safe. Where does this leave you?
So there you saw two skills, reflection with a little bit of affirmation. This is normal, you're not crazy. And then this very nice ask, tell, ask. I have some information. Would you like it? What do you make of it? And this can be used for virtually any of the either false beliefs or any of the just knowledge gaps that people will present with. Now I'd like to show you some video clips from our Getting to Yes study. So we have a vaccine trial funded by NIH going on in Michigan. We recruited 36 Black churches. Michigan has a large racial and ethnic difference in both COVID mortality rates as well as vaccine rates, unlike nationally where they've converged. In Michigan, African Americans are still about 9 points behind white Michiganders. So we asked pastors from across the state, and the videos are regional. So there are 4 cities that we have. We have one for Detroit, Ann Arbor, Ypsi, Flint, and Grand Rapids, if you know our state. I'm going to show you 2 of them. We simply told the pastors, tell us why you got vaccinated, or tell us why you want your congregants to be vaccinated. And then we edited the videos together. I'll show you 2 of them, and then we'll be ready for questions and answers.
Illness affects our wellness, and the quest for wellness helps us to get over illnesses. We can do this in this day and age by making sure everyone is vaccinated.
The reason why I got vaccinated was because I believe that is just the right thing to do.
I didn't have any problems. I feel just fine, and I'm doing well, and I'm thankful that I followed my mind to get vaccinated.
My question to you, to those of you who are still trying to make a decision about taking the vaccine, look into the information. Check it out for yourself.
We all are in this together.
I have a greater assurance and protection to fight against this virus. However, I am conscious that I must continue to be alert and take the appropriate measures until this COVID-19 pandemic is over.
Let's look at the second version of this.
I got vaccinated and was very public, even with my testing, because I believe that as a leader, we should lead in public and make sure that we're not asking anybody to do anything that we're not willing to do ourselves.
It is very important as a community leader, as a pastor within a thriving city, to encourage those in our community to get the vaccination.
I got vaccinated because I do not want to miss my daughter's wedding. I do not want to miss my son's wedding. I do not want to miss my parents. I don't want my parents to miss me. That's why I got vaccinated.
I would never ask anyone to do something I wouldn't do myself. Now that I have been vaccinated, I have championed the cause for individuals to get vaccinated. I've talked with individuals, I've prayed with individuals.
We would like to get back to some form of normalcy. After I got the vaccination, I felt a sense of security. I felt a sense of duty to my community, to my loved ones.
You do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. And so this vaccination and getting vaccine was not only helping myself, but it was also helping my neighbor.
And I wanted to get vaccinated. I wanted my family to get vaccinated so we could feel protected.
I felt it was important, just as important as every other annual or periodic vaccination that I needed for my health, as well as the health of those around me.
I took the challenge to get vaccinated so that they could see if I was okay, then it was okay for them to take.
You know, I try to be very sensitive to the people who are still hesitant about being vaccinated, because I know that it's an individual decision.
But I ask those individuals that are there and have not yet made the decision to become vaccinated or still sitting on the fence to please make sure that you're doing it for the right reasons. And that means you must get good information, because without good information.
So I hope you can see this is a sample of how we could use what we feel is a very trusted local source who has also walked the walk. Everyone in our videos had been vaccinated. So that ends the formal part of my presentation, and we'd love to open it up for questions and discussion.
That was fantastic, and thank you so much. I will share, we have one question in the Q&A about the data you showed, I think at the beginning of the presentation, breaking out some of the trends for Hispanic individuals, asking if there are separate estimates for immigrant versus US born folks, or by primary language or country of origin.
There are some data out there. We have some data on the MENA population because Michigan has the largest Middle Eastern North African population, and they're behind on average, white folks in Michigan. There are some other studies that I can hopefully get you references for that have looked at state level ethnic differences for Hispanic Latinx populations. They tend to be higher than you might expect. So there, in several of the studies have found higher rates among Hispanics than whites. Not all of them have found lower rates, in fact.
Thanks. Another question that came in was variation in vaccine uptake before and after an employer mandate. What is the role of mandates in changing people's perspectives?
It's a very good question. I believe what happened was in the early phase, it helped. So when the car manufacturers insisted, I do think it did drive up vaccination. I think that worked on the only if mandated group. That was actually an audience segment. That group is largely gone. It is our understanding of the data that the hard no group will not be responsive to employer mandates, but it did help in the original first 6 months. So we're talking January 21 to like June. I do believe the worksite mandates mattered. I'll just tell you one other thing. It wasn't asked, but we've written 2 papers. One's published, one's in press about the incentive programs across the United States. And we found absolutely no benefit of vaccine incentives either for adults or college age youth across the entire country. And that converges with 3 other papers that the incentives that were tried showed no boost in vaccine the next 2 to 6 weeks following the promotion.
Thanks. Another question is, the person appreciates the stats and data breaking down the hard no category especially. However, what are some strategies for an urban area such as ours in Hartford, Connecticut, where our vaccination hesitancy is a huge challenge for those, with the hard no who don't necessarily fall into those categories. So among those who are hard nosed and might not fit the ones that you described.
Yes. So that's been pointed out by our pastors a lot, that they feel the folks in their church who are not vaccinated still have a little crack in the door, that they still want conversation. So I think it's actually encouraging that in the African-American hard no, there's almost a subgroup of, but maybe, or I'll talk to you. So what we've done, and I'm happy to share this with you, is we've created an online training for, we call them vaccine champions, and we're training them in a version of motivational interviewing. And then I'm assigning them people who are not vaccinated. They may or may not be hard no. And basically just ask them to have a conversation in person or by phone. And hopefully our skilled champions can pry open that door that has a tiny crack in it. So if you'd like in Hartford or whomever, and I'll talk more about it in December presentation about getting access to our vaccine champions training. We're in the process of making a generic version. Will be done in 2 weeks. We'd love to share it with you and have these champions paired with these folks in your community, understanding that in the African-American community, hard no might be, but maybe behind it, which is actually, we think, a sign of hope.
I'll share a couple other comments that are coming through, and folks feel free to send other questions. Someone was saying they have had good success with incentives as a supportive housing nonprofit. Another comment that vaccine hesitant African Americans seem more likely to get vaccinated if they're living with an at-risk elder. So I don't know if you have anything to respond to on either of those comments.
The second one, I have something. The first one, I would like to hear more from him or her. So we did work during the heat of the initial vaccine hesitance with several Hollywood showrunners, people who are in charge of very popular TV shows. They wanted to write characters who were talking to hard no relatives. And what we found is there was one particular communication strategy that worked, and that was what we call the off-ramp. You're right, you don't need it. You're right, your immune system is strong. You're right, it's an oppressive action from the left. All that's right. However, grandma can't afford to be exposed. And so we gave them this sort of non-ego threatening out, which is, you're right, you don't need it. But if you're not vaccinated, grandma's at risk. And that off-ramp, what we called the protector scenario, really seems to have legs in the hard no group, because there's this part of them that knows, well, elders are dying from it. That's not easy to deny. And so that doing it for grandma or for immunocompromised people in your home is a very good appeal that doesn't have to argue any of the other stuff. Everything else we can agree on. The whole thing is a conspiracy. Your immune system is great. However, grandma still benefit if you get it. So I think there's a lot there. In terms of who has had a positive experience for incentives, we've had very positive experience of convenience, of bringing vaccination to people where they meet, churches, markets. But I'd love to hear how incentives helped you, because at least in the national data, there's very little signal that it boosted vaccine at the county or state level. Doesn't mean on a small individual basis, it didn't work. So I'd love to hear about your positive experience.
Yes, folks, feel free to share those. Someone shared cash and Visa gift cards were used for each dose, booster, and referrals, and that did seem to increase rates at individual community vaccination clinics. Another,
go ahead. The one cute one I saw in a Michigan church we work in, they were giving massage devices. I forgot what they're called, but those high-end ones that have very rapid thing, they were giving those out if you got your vaccine. I thought that was brilliant. Sorry.
No. Another question is about peer outreach. Someone notes that tenants responded better to information from neighbors instead of from staff.
Yeah. Yep. That's the vaccine champions are lay people. They're not, they may be masters of PhD prepared, but most are not. So I do believe that your neighbors and friends who can have skilled conversation is a great way to go. So I think that's a fantastic thing to do. And I think we should really get together to build that army. I kind of feel as a nation, we've missed that, but it's not too late to build an army of people, of skilled communicators who can talk to people as friends and neighbors.
A lot of other comments about incentives. So it seems like this is really an area where people have had a lot of experiences. I also wanted to bring up, someone shared that they had used the off-road when working with someone with vaccine hesitancy.
Yes, with immune. Yes, that's the same thing. But my immune-compromised son or cousin still needs you to be vaccinated, even though you don't need it personally. They don't have that luxury. I think that's a very powerful, non-threatening approach. So it very well may be that these incentives work in different subpopulations that the large national data masks. So I'm going to go back and talk to our team to see if we could look by income. We only have state and county level data, but we can't match it to census data. Perhaps in under-resourced communities, incentives did work. So it's absolutely possible. I am not denying that your observations aren't real. Very well could be the case.
Someone has a question about the issue of the belief that getting vaccines so often could make the virus change. So I wonder if you have responses on that position and how to discuss that question with folks.
So that on the individual level, it will cause you risk, or on the societal level, the more people get vaccinated, the more it will mutate.
I
Which
think
is the
this
concern?
comment is the societal, the virus itself for society. Mhm.
Yeah, so we have not addressed that particular concern. Scientifically, I know it not to be the case, but we haven't built a case on that. So it's something we will do. If we find more of that, we definitely want to build both an FAQ for that and a interaction scene that communicates around that issue. And it would probably use the same formula of we hear that a lot, or that's common, or that's very reasonable to worry about, that affirmation. And then we would do ask tell ask to say if it's okay, I'd like to share what we know about mutation and whether or not if a protected population is more likely to drive mutation. I think that would be a potentially powerful scene we could add. Thank you for suggesting it.
One question I have is just thoughts on, I know some of our partners are working not just with COVID vaccines, but with flu and other vaccines for adults, whether any of these lessons would apply to other vaccines.
So there is an interesting thing that, as you guys probably know, generally the vaccines have not been distributed through primary care, which is normally where we get our vaccines. And in primary care, there's something called presumptive intervention. We can't do that in community-based injection of our vaccines. If it was in primary care, we could use presumptive intervention, and it goes like this. I'm going to give you a non-vaccine example from smoking cessation, and then I'll bring it back to vaccine. So in smoking cessation, if I'm your primary care doc and you're a smoker, and I know that about you, I can see, by the way, I've left a prescription for nicotine replacement on the desk, by the way. And they now have to exert resistance to say no. Well, they do that with vaccines. And by the way, today I have the nurse coming in with your flu vaccine, unless you don't want it. Once we get into primary care where it can be bundled with other vaccines, we could start to test presumptive intervention. And it can be very powerful, particularly for people in the middle. For the hard-nosed, they still may say, no, doc, screw you. But certainly for people who are in the various crack in the door groups, we think that's actually promising. So I'm hoping we will be moving vaccines into primary care so we can bundle it with other things and take advantage of presumptive intervention.
Well, everyone's sharing some great examples in the chat.
Yes, I am very inspired now. I tonight am emailing my statistician. I'm going to ask her to look at income by county to see if maybe there's a signal there, because when I see this much positive experience, it's usually telling us something.
We are reaching the end of our time almost, so I did want to, oh, this is a good question. And then I wanted to see if you could reflect on what your next webinar will go into for folks who are interested. But someone said, do you think the fact that it will be charged, I think meaning that there will soon be a cost for vaccines, it won't necessarily be covered, will impact uptake?
It certainly will. And therefore, it's my hope that the government will continue to subsidize this, because it is not just the right thing to do, it's cost effective for the economy. So yeah, I'm really hoping we won't get into people having to pay much out of pocket. And what will we do with the under and uninsured and FQHCs and community clinics? We really have to keep that friction low. We can't be charging people a lot of money for that. It will impact uptake almost certainly. And it will create a disparity, which I'm sure is behind your question, that for people for whom $20 is substantial, it's going to be a strong demotivator. So our workshop in a couple of weeks, we'll be showing you the skills of motivational interviewing, this thing called reflective listening and affirmation. And we'll show you some more clips of how to use it for specific discussions around COVID-19, either misconceptions or knowledge gaps. And I think it'll be in the same format as this, and we hope you guys will attend.
Well, it sounds like there's a lot of positive feedback to, so Bridget, thank you for posting the part 2 link right there. And we'll put up on the screen now a couple of additional upcoming webinars There's one that's not a part of the series, but it's coming up soon. Winning proposals. I'll put this in the chat right now. Winning proposals to sustain your health equity work, which will include a panel of PAVE-funded organizations that have recently been able to secure funding for some of their health equity work, some big federal awards. So that's exciting. And then, as I said, this webinar today is the first of a series of 4 events, followed by an additional webinar with Dr. Resnikow on motivational interviewing, and then 2 interactive workshops, one in English, one in Spanish, on those difficult conversations, practicing motivational interviewing strategies. And so we hope you'll be able to join us for those. We're going to pop up a quick poll, if you don't mind answering that as part of our process. That's always very helpful to us, and looks from the comments that a lot of people really found this great. So Dr. Resnikow, I really want to thank you for your time today. This has been very interesting.
My pleasure. I hope to see some of you again in a few weeks. And I'm going to do those analyses hopefully by then, and I'll also get you the address for the champion training.
Fantastic. Thank you again. And thank you to all of you, PAVE members and others working on vaccine equity. Really appreciate you joining us today.
That was fun. Thank you.
Thank you.